Hey everyone, in this video we're going to take a look at chapter 47 from book 5 of Caesar's De Bello Gallico. So remember, we're looking at Ambiorix's revolt. We're right in the middle of the Gallic Wars in the winter of 54 BCE, and we're seeing that at this point Ambiorix has already attacked a couple forts. He's besieging Cicero, and Caesar, now that he's aware of the situation, right, the messengers have finally reached him. He's mobilizing his troops to make a response, and that's where we kind of pick up the narrative. Caesar's already reached out, told some of his top lieutenants to bring their troops to him, and he's going to march and try to relieve the siege happening with Cicero. Now, before we dive in, though, the thing I always tell you in these videos is the first place you want to start is just make sure you understand the vocab, okay? So it's really hard to know what's going on if you don't know what the words mean, and there's a couple of different ways you can kind of accomplish this. The first one is just pre-read on your own, go through the chapter, look for any words you don't know, and make a list, right? Practice it, and you should be good. These are so well-known, these passages, for the AP curriculum, that you should be able to find anything you need really on Quizlet or online somewhere. There's commentaries, whatever it might be. I've said before, Jeffrey Stedman has a great commentary on this, but there's ways you can find vocab lists. Practice it. That way you at least have a jump start on knowing what the words are, even if the grammar is a little tricky. The other thing that you want to do is try to read aloud. I say this in all my videos, but reading it aloud is important. It brings the language to life. It might unlock something that helps you understand what's going on in the Latin, as opposed to just doing it in your head. I know that's difficult, especially if you're an AP student. Your time is crunched. You don't have a ton of time, but you want to take at least a little bit to read this aloud. If you can find a classmate to read it back to you, you can work on your listening skills. That's all really important. I'll read it to you in this video, but like I tell you, my pronunciation is nothing fantastic. You're better off doing it on your own. And the last bit of advice I always give is take some time to do what I call the read and reread method, right? I'm not the one who's invented it. I just think it works, right? I always say this to my students. You should read through the story, write this chapter, start to finish, write down any problem areas you have, and then when you're done, try to figure out where you went wrong. And this is where having a vocab list will help. If it's a word you don't know, that means you got to practice it. If it's grammar you don't know, this is where a commentary becomes really, really important, and it can help you understand what's going on with the grammar. But one way or another, you want to try to shore up your problem areas and then repeat that process. And again, I know your time is crunched if you're an AP student, right? It's difficult, but this will also lock it into your long-term memory. You're reading so much in Caesar, right, and in the AP curriculum, it's very difficult to remember everything. If you want to put it into your long-term memory, doing that process of reading it over and over again a few times till you get it is really the best way to go. And if you can go start to finish without any problems, without having to look anything up, or at least understanding the majority of it, that's how you know you're in a really good place and you're ready to move on. Okay, so if you haven't done that, pause the video, go work on it on your own. But otherwise, we'll take it a line at a time, unpack it, and hopefully your translation, is somewhere close to mine. You can use mine as sort of a guidepost to get you. Again, might have some differences here and there, but in general, it should help you understand what's going on with this chapter. Okay, so the chapter kicks off like this. You have ora circiter tertia ab anti cursoribus de crassi adventu certior factus, eo die milia passuum XX, right, the number 20, procede. So we're talking about Caesar here. And the main verb you're looking for is at the end, proceded, right? He proceeded, he went out, right? It's talking about with his army. So you have a couple of ablatives in the beginning, right? Giving the time, ora tertia, right? So at around the third hour. And again, when you're talking about time, when you're dealing with Latin, it's talking about the third hour of the day. It's not 3 in the morning or 3 in the afternoon, anything like that. It's 3 hours after the sun came up. So you could say it's maybe somewhere around 9 in the morning, right? But it is early on, right? He sets off, right? So Caesar marches off, okay? And the reason he does this is because he's factus certio, right? This is an idiom that we see a lot with Caesar. It means he was like literally made more certain. So having been made more certain. But what it really means is like having been informed, right? Is probably a good way to do it. You have the comparative there going with the perfect passive participle, right? From facio. But this is something we've seen before in Caesar. So having been made more certain, or having been informed about, right, de adventu Crassi, about the arrival of Crassus. Remember, Crassus showed up. He's one of the lieutenants that he called back. He's like, okay, Crassus is here. I'm getting ready to set off. He knows that Crassus is going to take over, and we'll see kind of what Crassus does in a little bit. But he also have ab ante cursoribus here, which means by the scouts. So he was informed or made more certain by the scouts, right? So it literally means something more like an advanced guard, probably is kind of one way to do it. I think scouts makes the most sense, right? So he knows that Crassus is coming, and he decides to march out, okay? And he marches out AODA on that day, and he goes milia passuum XX, right? So he goes 20 miles, literally 20 thousands of paces, right? So 20 miles. So he marches off from where he is, Samarabriga, and he's already on the move, right? Because he knows Crassus is coming, and he's going to kind of form his army on the way, all right? Then you go to the next line. You have crassum, samaro brivae praeficit legionemque, there we go, attribuit, quod ibi impedimenta exercitus obsides civitatum literas publicas frumentumque, omne quod eo tolerandae hiemis causa devexerat relinquebat. Right? So he's leaving behind is kind of where you want to start, or at least think. So relinquebat is going to be kind of the key thought here. He's leaving behind something, but before that, you can see that he's doing a couple of things before he leaves. So you have attribuit crassum. So sorry, not attribute, praeficit crassum. So when you're using this verb, the idea is that you're putting someone in charge of something is kind of how it goes. So this is the verb praeficio, right, which means to like, I think in some dictionaries you see it means like to set someone over something, but I think it's easier to understand it as to put something in charge of something. So when you do that, the person put in charge is going to be in the accusative, which is crassum here. So he puts Crassus in charge of or over Samaro Brivae, which is the town, the center where Caesar was staying for the winter, kind of his seat, right, for the winter. It's an important spot where he was staying. So this is how Crassus kind of comes into his role in this. He's not marching off with the army. He's being put in charge of the administrative center. And this actually makes a lot of sense. And we'll talk about this in the end of the video, but Crassus is a quaestor, right? Which is like an administrative position in a lot of ways, his rank. So he's going to tell him, hey, you're in charge of the town, right? And everything in it. And not only that, but he attribuit legionem. So he assigns a legion to him, right? So Crassus is staying in the city with a legion. And Caesar tells you why, right? Because he relinquebat, he had left behind, or he left behind there, meaning in Samara Brivae, he left behind the impedimenta, the baggage, exercitus of the army, right? So the army stuff is all there, along with the obsides civitatum, right? The hostages of the states, meaning like the Gallic hostages, they're all in this town. And the literas publicas, the public records, right? So this would be all the records of the army, anything he needed, any written documents, important and kind of sensitive stuff is already there, right? The last thing that's left there is the frumentum, the grain, right? Omne frumentum is all the grain. So it's all the grain which he had like carried devexera, he had carried for the sake of causa, for the sake of toleranda hiemis, of enduring the winter, right? So what you're looking at there, when you have the toleranda hiemis, is that gerundive, right? So again, you can kind of translate. I think the easiest thing to do is just make it like a gerund, an ing. So the toleranda is the tolerating or withstanding, and then you have hiemis, right? Winter. So it's set off because there's the preposition causa there, for the sake of. So this whole thing is basically acting as the object of it, for the sake of surviving the winter, right? So again, he had carried it there. So in other words, all the grain that he had put in the city, Samara Brivae, which is where his center was. And he had carried it AO there because they're trying to survive the winter. Remember, that's the whole reason he had to split his army apart in the first place, is to break them up because they can't all fit in one spot. This is where Caesar's like administrative center is. So there's a lot of important stuff here, right? Again, records, hostages, baggage, the grain. So he can't leave it unprotected. So he leaves Crassus with a legion. But we'll talk about it. It's an interesting choice to put Crassus because he is the quaestor. But either way, the way you want to think about it is Caesar leaves everything under control and he sets off, right? So he's not looking to have his all his important stuff unprotected. Okay. Then we continue in the next line, and you have Fabius, ut imperatum erat non ita multum moratus in itinere cum legione occurre. So you have Fabius. Remember, he had reached out to Fabius too, saying, hey, come meet me. So here we have ut imperatum erat. So the on imperatum, it's not referring to Fabius, right? Because then it would have to be imperatus. This is the impersonal, right? So it's just saying Fabius as it had been commanded, right? It almost feels like it should be as he had been commanded, but it is technically it, right? So as it had been commanded. And then you have non moratus, so not having been delayed, or having been delayed not that much, right? Nonita multum. So Fabius, again, is the one who's not being delayed that much, so he's able to come meet Caesar quickly is the idea. He occurrit, so Caesar ran into him, right? Bumped into him in itinere cum legione, with his legion, right? So on the journey with a legion. So Fabius is basically meeting Caesar on the way. He's not going all the way back to Samara Brevi. He's like, no, I'll meet you on the way. So Fabius shows up, and now again Caesar is supplementing his forces. So remember, the three men that we were talking about were Crassus, Fabius, and Labienus, right? Fabius has met Caesar, Crassus has met Caesar, and he's going to stay behind. The third person that needs to kind of fall in line here that Caesar called upon was his kind of right hand man, Labienus, right, who commands his cavalry, sort of the second in command in Gaul. And we're going to see what happens to him right now, right, when we go on to the next line. So you have Labienus interitus Sabini et caede cohortium cognita cum omnes ad eum treverorum copiae venissent. Veritus, si ex hibernis fugae similem profectionem fecisset, ... right? It's a longer line, so I'll just kind of cut it here. But let's start unpacking it. So Labienus, right? You have the ablative absolute here. So with the death of Sabinus, the interitu Sabini, and the caede cohortium, the slaughter of the cohorts is kind of one way to do it, having been known or learned. So in other words, after Labienus figures out what happened to Sabinus and Cotta, right, it kind of changes his decision. So you have, with this having been known, and since omnes copiae treverorum, so all the troops, the forces of the Treveri, right, that's the region he's in, venissent ad eum, had come to him, right? So all the troops of the Treveri, this Gallic tribe, are marching towards Labienus, right? So since this is happening, he's veritus, he's fearing that if fecisset profectionem, so if he had made a profectionem, a departure, and it's a departure similem fugae, so a departure that's similar to a flight, a retreat might be a better way to do it, similar to a retreat. So if he had done this, you have this conditional phrase happening here, that if he had done this and he had made a departure from his winter quarters, ... something is going to happen. Okay, but before we get to the rest of the line, it's interesting to kind of unpack what's going on here. Because again, this is Caesar's kind of top lieutenant, his right-hand man, and he's already figured out that Sabinus and Cotta are dead. So that's in the back of his mind. He's like, wait a minute, right? Caesar's calling me to leave, but here's the problem. He knows the Treveri are coming, right? So he's already aware that the Treveri are marching onto his location. He's like, if I leave my winter quarters, if I make a departure, right, we're going to have a major issue here. And he says that departure is going to look similar to a flight, a retreat. So he's afraid that if he goes out of the winter quarters, the Treveri are going to think he's retreating and they're going to attack him just like they did Sabinus and Cotta, and he's going to be in some trouble, right? So veritus, the fearing part, is kind of what's governing all this, right? And he's afraid. He's like, if I do this, there's going to be a major issue here. So then we finish the line, right? So you go on to it's just the second half of the line, really. But you have ut hostium impetum sustinere posset, praesertim quos recenti victoria eferi scire, literas Caesari remitit, quanto cum periculo legionem ex hibernis educturus esset, ... And again, it actually goes on further, and we'll kind of get the last part in the next slide. But again, Labienus is really the focus here. He's the one who's afraid. So he's afraid if he leaves, he's going to be in trouble, right? So then it continues. He says, he just went through. And he's like, if I make a retreat that looks like, or sorry, if I make a departure that looks like a retreat from my winter quarters, right? He's fearing that he would not be able, right? So the ut here is really making a negation because you have this fearing clause, right? So the ut is probably best translated as that, not, or that not. So he's fearing that he would not, is kind of one way to do the ut posse, that he would not be able to sustinere, right? To sustain the impetum hostium, the attack of the enemy, right? And this is what we were talking about in the previous slide. He's afraid that what happened to Sabinus and Cotta is going to happen to him, right? He's like, there's too many. If they catch me out in the open, there's a problem. So he's thinking that his best bet is to stay in his winter quarters, right? So he says, this is going to be an issue. I'm not going to be able to sustain him. Praesertim, which means, especially, right? Especially because he knew Skiret, right? So the Skiret here, you could almost say like, since he knew, right? So it's introducing the quos there. You've got this sort of relative clause. And again, a lot of commentaries point out it's really causal in sense. So it kind of feels like a cum clause. And I think in some commentaries, they point out too that quos is really like cum eos is how it's functioning here. but he's especially afraid of this since he knew that those people, right, the Treveri, they were elated, effere, they were lifted up, kind of literally, right? They were elated or excited by the recenti victoria, by the recent victory, right? So he's like, they're already piped up over what happened with Sabinus and Cotta. They're going to be riding high. He's like, this isn't going to go well. They're already happy. They're excited. They're ready to fight, and I'm going to march out. This is going to be a disaster. So what he does is he remitted literas Caesar. So he sent back, right? Remitted. He wrote back basically a letter to Caesar, right? Letters to Caesar, literas Caesari. So he sent back a letter to Caesar, right? And he's saying basically what he states is that with how much quanto pericolo, how much danger, right? It would be, right. So he's going to talk about the danger of leading them out of the winter quarters. So then you have the educturus esset there. So the educturus esset is a future periphrastic, right? So you have that future participle, the educturus, going with esse soon, right? Esset there. So it's still part of this idea of what he's writing to Caesar for, but literally it would mean something like was going to lead out, would probably be the way to do it, or would lead out. So you can say it together. You could say, like, he wrote to him that he was going to lead out the legionum, the legion ex hibernis, from winter quarters, with how much danger he was going to do this. So in the letter he writes back, he's explaining and stating, with how much danger he was going to lead out the legion from the winter quarters. So he's telling Caesar, if I do this, we're going to have a major problem on our hands, right? This is a dangerous thing. It's too dangerous to leave. So again, if you want to kind of tidy that up, he's writing to Caesar with how much danger, you could say, he was about to lead his legion from winter quarters, right? So again, he's not going to take him out, is the idea. And then you finish the line, you have rem gestam in eburionibus perscribit, docet omnes equitatus peditatusque copias trevorum tria milia passuum longe absuis castris concedisse. So this finishes the thought of what's going on with Labienus, but he perscribit. So he writes, he thoroughly describes, I think is kind of one way to do it, but he's describing the rem gestam, right? The affair having been carried out, the situation having been carried out among the Eburones. Now, what he's referring to here is Sabinus and Cotta. So remember, the Eburones are the ones who killed Sabinus and Cotta. So he's writing to Caesar again. He's like, just look at what happened to them. This is not going to go well, right? He's describing that situation like this is not going to end well. So again, kind of making his case of why he's not going to leave the winter quarters, right? And he informs him, right? Informs Caesar that that all of the cavalry, so omnes equitatus, all of the cavalry and the peditatusque and the infantry, right? Or you might even say like all the troops of cavalry and of infantry of the Treveri, right? Treverorum, they had taken a position. So concedissa, they had kind of camped, is really what it is, siege. You're taking a position 3 miles away. So you have tria milia passuum, again, 3,000s of paces, but literally more, maybe not literally, the best way to do it is 3 miles. There we go. So 3 miles further or away from suis castris, from his camp. So the Treveri are very close. They have all this cavalry, all their infantry. He's like, I can't make it, right? So this is the only hang up to Caesar's plan. Labienus is not able to get out of his winter quarters, and he's going to be fighting his own battle to survive against the Treveri, right? But he at least lets Caesar know that I'm not going to be able to make it, okay? So that's all there is in chapter 47. Again, this is the second to last one in the AP curriculum, but we're seeing a lot of, again, Caesar's plans and what he was hoping to do. And now we get a little hiccup in his plan because Labienus isn't going to make it. But the Romans are preparing, right, to respond and fight off Ambiorix and stop this rebellion, right, this revolt that's happening. So a couple of things that are worth thinking about, even in this chapter where, again, not a ton going on, but there's some interesting references happening. Again, Caesar's speed. So marching 20 miles in a day is pretty impressive, right? So Caesar mentions that he made it 20 miles. That's impressive, but it's also probably possible because he has the smaller force, right? So the smaller size of his force that he's bringing. And remember, he's not bringing everything. So you kind of organize some food and stuff like that, whatever you need, but he's traveling light, he's traveling quick. And you can see how far he can march. That's pretty good, right? 20 miles is a pretty good pace. The other thing that you can notice here is that Caesar's confidence is boosted, right? He knows Crassus is coming to support him and to take over his administrative center, right? That's interesting. So he's happy that Crassus is here. But again, you want to think about what's going on with Fabius. So when Caesar leaves and departs, it's because he knows Crassus is there. He actually doesn't know where Fabius necessarily is, and it works out. He probably knew, like, yeah, he's going to meet me. But it is interesting to note that he probably couldn't be certain that Fabius was not going to get attacked on the way. But again, just little insights into Caesar and the way he thinks. He's like, don't worry, Fabius will meet him along the way. It all works out in the end. But a couple of side notes that are worth thinking about that are references here, or at least things to understand. I mentioned this before, but Crassus is a quaestor, right, which is kind of a lower rank in the army. And it usually is the person who's overseeing, like I said, the administrative tasks. So it actually makes a lot of sense that Caesar would put this person in charge of his administrative center. So that's where Crassus kind of fills that role and helps Caesar be able to leave, because Caesar's confident knowing everything's safe. There's a legion there, and there's someone who understands what's supposed to happen. That's his job. That's who should be in charge of the city while he's gone. The other interesting thing, though, is what happened with Labienus. So we just read he's not able to support Caesar because the Treveri are coming. But we've heard of this group before. And if you think back, the Treveri played a role very early on in Book 5 because their leader is Indutio Maris, right? And that name should sound familiar. I know it was a lot of chapters ago at this point, but Indutio Maris is the leader who urges on Ambiorix, right? So when Ambiorix first makes his decision to attack the Romans and take out Sabinus and Cotta, Indutio Maris is one of the leaders of it, right? Urging him on, like, yeah, you'll be fine. And Indutio Maris is the one who's like, yeah, don't worry, I'll go and incite my people. His people are the Treveri, and here he is, right? He's the leader. He's not named in this chapter, but Indutio Maris is the one who is leading this attack on Labienus. So he kind of comes back full circle. It's been 20 chapters since we've actually heard his name, since the very beginning of this narrative, but still, that's the person who's attacking Labienus, right? So Ambiorix goes after Sabinus and Cotta, and now Indutio Maris shows up attacking Labienus, and he plays a big role because now Labienus, who is one of Caesar's best commanders, is not able to support him, which is kind of the plan, right? That's the whole idea: isolate the Romans and attack them. In the story, and I'd encourage you to look it up, when you see what happened in the actual narrative that we don't cover in the AP curriculum, Labienus actually defeats the Treveri, and the way he does it is he orders an attack, and he specifically tells his men to kill Indutio Maris, right? So when this leader is killed, the Treveri forces kind of dissipate, right, and they're done. But it is interesting that we have kind of an older name coming back, or at least an older group of people that we mentioned in the very beginning of Book 5. Now they show up again, and if you read between the lines a little bit, you'll be able to catch an old name here of Indutio Maris and how he plays back into the narrative, because again, we haven't seen him in a little while. But either way, we're about right at the end of where the AP curriculum goes. We have one more chapter. If you have any questions at all on this chapter, there's some trickier parts in the story. Just put it in the comments below. I'll be happy to explain anything. If I rush through it or anything like that or wasn't clear, let me know. We'll put it in the comments below. But otherwise, hopefully it made some sense to you and you're able to translate it and read through. And like I said, if you can go through start to finish on this, you understand what's happening, and you don't need too much help, that's probably a good sign that you're ready to move on. Good luck.